Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's great to see everyone here. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So you are currently attending a talk that is both a post-mortem for this game, Hellscaper, and a sort of lessons learned about Deckbuilder roguelike design. Hellscaper is a game that I designed for a senior capstone project. Other people on our team were Jake, Una, and Fergus. Fergus was our artist, so they made the art on the slide and all the art in the game that isn't programmer art. And yeah, huge thanks to the team and everybody. Before I start, I want to thank also everyone who I talked to in preparation for this. This is not everybody, but some of the people I talked to, Dan Trampoline Tales, who made Luck Be a Landlord, Brian Cronin, who is one of the developers on Monster Train, Jay and Axolotl, who are both making really cool strategy games, and then everyone from the Boston scene, specifically John, Shane, Matt, and Ichiro, who all helped me talk through some of this deck builder roguelike stuff. Hellscaper is an occult tiling roguelike deck builder, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I'll break down what it means exactly. And specifically, we're focusing on the roguelike deck builder part of it today because I think that's the place where we learn the most about it and the places that we could improve the most, and just what I was interested in talking about. The thing that makes the genre what it is this deck building part, which sits on top of the main thing that you do in the game, which I'm referring to as the core loop. So yeah, the core loop is like at the center of the game, and then you draft a deck of cards, or maybe they're not cards, but a set of things that you have that changes what you can do in the core loop, and that's what a deck builder roguelike is. Hellscaper, the core loop is this tiling game. You can see I'm placing these tiles down and getting points. And then this is the deck building part. So I'm looking through the cards that I have in my deck to choose one to get rid of, and I get to choose one to add to my deck as well. So as that happens, my deck gets more powerful, and I need to make my deck more powerful because the game gets harder and harder. So in the later levels, you need more points, which means you need a better deck that works better together. And before I go into everything, I know it's a bit of like a niche topic, so I wanted to give some motivation of like why you might care about deck builder roguelikes. The first reason in my mind is that there's just a lot of them. This is the graph of games released on Steam that are tagged with deck builder roguelike over year. And it might kind of look like it's stagnating from 2022 to 2023 until you realize that 2023 is not over yet. So we're probably going to see a lot more by the time the year ends. Honestly, it might even be a higher number now since I took the screenshot a couple days ago. With that popularity comes the question of whether the genre is saturated. My opinion is that it's not. One of the reasons for that is there's a lot of interest on YouTube for it, a lot of people streaming. These are all examples from one person because when you search by number of views, these are the things that come up. He also featured our game, which is really nice. This was by far the most traction that we got was from this video. And this guy, Retromation Rito, he basically covers like every single deck builder roguelike that comes out either on itch or on Steam. And there's a big appetite for it. People like watching them, people like playing them. And I think it's a great genre to work in, partially because in a lot of genres, even if you make a really, really great game, it can be really hard to get noticed. But with these kind of games, at least right now, it's like at least someone is going to pay some attention to it, and then it lives or dies whether it's like actually good. So back to this deck core loop thing. One of the other reasons that it is so popular and it doesn't easily get saturated, in my opinion, is that whenever you replace the core loop, it kind of ends up being a different game. And it still has this meta structure, but like you wouldn't say that every game that has like a leveling system, they're all the same game because you're doing different things to level up. And it's kind of like that where in every game you're constructing a deck and you're changing what you can do in the game, but it's very, very flexible what it can actually do. So there's like a huge breadth of kinds of games that you can make in this overall genre of deck builder roguelike. Another reason you might want to design it is they're just fun to design. I've made a lot of like shorter, more like narrative games, and one problem with those is that once you're playtesting it for like the 100th time, you really don't have access to the same emotional experience as your players because what you put in the game just doesn't really read to you anymore as like meaningful text. And obviously, you still need to play test. You need players that are better than you to like vet out what the game is like, and way at the end of it. And you also need players who are new, like constantly, because you need to keep assessing the new player experience. But at least you always have access to this. Like, if you enjoy the game that you're making, and if you like these kind of games, then you will always have yourself, at least as one person, who can go in and play test and see feel the same emotional experience. And that is always true, which is not always true of other kinds of games that you might make. Another sort of motivation for this talk is I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about applies to most strategy games, not just deck builder roguelikes. And finally, if you're just a fan of the genre or just a fan of games in general, I think understanding how a genre breaks down and like why all of the features are there and what they accomplish is helpful for appreciating the games that you're playing. So all that out of the way, this is a post-mortem for Hellscaper, so I'm going to be focusing on like where we went wrong with Hellscaper. And I think that the main way that we went wrong is that it's not as fun as it should be. It's not as fun as it could be. And that might sound a little bit disparaging, but I mean that in a very specific way. The way that I mean that is particularly for the deck building decisions. On this screen, when you're choosing one to get rid of and one to add to your deck, this decision is not very fun. And more specifically, it's not very K-fun, which is a term introduced by Ralph Koster in his book, A Theory of Fun. And K-fun refers to the fun that you get when you learn something. And in this book, he argues pretty convincingly, to my mind, that the majority of what we talk about when we talk about fun really refers to the fun of learning, like maybe 90% of it or something. But just to be safe and not confuse people with the last 10%, because fun can be kind of a fuzzy word, he just introduces this term K-fun to mean the fun of learning. And so we can just talk about that. And I think that K-fun is the main flavor that players enjoy in these games and in a lot of strategy games is the fun of learning. So when we're talking about the fun of learning and like the amount of fun that you can have learning something, that's really deeply tied to how much you can learn about something. And how much you can learn about something is basically what depth means. Depth of a decision or depth of a system or depth of a problem is like how much can you learn about this while still being like useful. So this very professional diagram on the right is my sort of diagram for this. This is what Frank Lantz calls a skill chain, and some other people call it that as well. Basically, each of these circles represents a skill level that you can have, or like an amount that you can know about a system, or again a problem or a decision, or however you want to say it. Anything that has depth has this skill chain, and the depth is kind of like the length of the skill chain. And another important property of this is at any one of these like circles, if you are at that circle, then you should be noticeably better at the game than someone who's like further down. And that just means that you're learning things that are useful. This is originally introduced to talk about multiplayer games, so it makes a little bit more sense there to talk about how good I am with respect to you. But it's definitely applicable for single player games as well, which deck builder roguelikes usually are. Another way of thinking about depth is the length of time that I would need to take to tell you about like how to make one of these decisions. And this is an example I pulled from the Slay the Spire subreddit. Slay the Spire is like the grandfather of, it's not very old, but the grandfather of like modern deck builder roguelikes. And it's also still the gold standard. It's really, really good. If you were here at the beginning, I was talking about how I was still playing it. So this is somebody who's played it a lot, and they're writing this post, and they say it's a quick guide on how to build game-winning decks on the hardest difficulty level, and they mention that they have 400 hours in it, and then they go on, and then they keep going on in the comments, and people talk about it and argue with them. And this is like what depth looks like. If there's one image I want in your head when I say depth, it's like you want people to do this for your game. You want people to be like, what is the right decision? And then like argue about it forever. Yeah, this is like what depth is. This is also what depth is. There are like two ways of looking at it. Another way of illuminating this is to take a counterexample. So War is a card game. It's like a classic card game where you have a deck of 52 cards 2, 3, 4, Jack, Queen, King, Ace, and some cards in the middle as well. And you just flip over the top card of your deck, and you show it to your opponent, and they flip over their top card, and whoever has the higher card wins. So if you were to make this a deck builder, because like the diagram before, you're like, okay, I have this core loop of picking up a card and showing it to my opponent, and I would like to make this deeper, so I'm going to make it a deck builder. And you would immediately realize that it would be a terrible deck builder, because when you're picking the cards, there's like no choice to make. You just would pick the highest card every single time. And it's obviously a very simple example, but there are ways that even more complex games can kind of like degenerate down to this state. What you really want for depth is to have multiple factors that you have to consider, and for none of them to dominate the decision. So in the war example, there's only one factor, which is the number on the card, and that makes it very easy to decide what to take. So this is a good point to talk about Luck Be a Landlord. Luck Be a Landlord is a roguelike deck builder that breaks the rule that I talked about, because it does not have a core loop. It takes it out and replaces it with a slot machine. And this is what that looks like. So Luck Be a Landlord basically just has cards. And there's asterisks there because that's not quite true, which I'll get into later. But pretty much it just has cards, which are called symbols in the game because it's a slot machine. And the entire decision of which one to put into your deck just comes down to what other cards you have in your deck. Because the game is just cards, and it's just random how they come out. The only factor is what other cards you have in your deck. And so the what other cards you have in your deck has to be the multiple factors that make it very deep. And it does. And the way that does that is through synergy, which is just when two things are worth more than the sum of their parts. So because one thing plus another thing is like better than just either of them on their own, and that's true in different amounts for different pairs of cards, you every card in your deck changes the value of all the other future cards that you're going to get. And to some extent, your prediction of the future also changes the value of every card you might pick. And so all that together creates a very deep decision. And if you contrast that with Hellscaper, specifically, I want to talk about one card that I think is particularly bad. We have synergy. We have synergy in the game. We actually have like too strong of a synergy. So this example, Cinders. Cinders is worth no points on its own, but if it's surrounded by fire, it becomes a Cinder Demon, which is worth 16 points, which is really, really high for the game. Like most cards are worth around 4 points on average. So if you can get Cinder Demons, it's like really, really strong, which means because Cinders is both so bad on its own and so good with other fire cards, it essentially means that when you pick it and add it to your deck, all of the values of all the other cards go way crazy, and all the fire cards go way up, and all the other cards go way down, and it essentially makes it so that it's the war situation again, because you can just like memorize a list of cards to take and just take them. So this is my very beautiful diagram of what that looks like. On the left is a web. Basically, both of these are like webs of synergies. So if you picture the end of each of these lines being a card and all the lines being like connecting them, then on the left is Hellscaper, and there's like pretty much 3 big clusters of like decks that you can draft, decks that you can construct that will be able to beat the final level. And there's lots of synergies within those, but then there's very few synergies that go outside of those lines, outside of those like clusters. And because of that, once you start down one of those paths, there's really not much reason for you to deviate from that. And so it quickly degenerates into the war example. And on the right is something more like Luck Be a Landlord, where there's a lot of smaller clusters, like 2 or 3 cards that work really well together, but then also each of them can work with some other cards. And it's much more spread out. It's much more of like a whole system. And because of that, it is much more deep. And you can't just, there's not one heuristic that dominates your decisions. There's not just one factor that dominates your decisions. You have to hold them all in your head at once, which makes it more deep. This is my water break. Nice. Okay, moving on. Okay, so we just talked about depth, which again relates to K-Fun, because depth is the amount of learning that you can do. But it's not exactly K-Fun, because K-Fun is about learning. And just because there's a lot you could learn about something doesn't mean that you're actually going to learn it. So this next section is about like how do you actually get your players to learn things. A really useful thing to think about here is cognitive load, which is essentially just the observation that players can only hold so much stuff in their mind at the same time. There's some interesting psychological research about this. My understanding is that people can generally hold between like 4 to 7 things in their head at the same time, which is like really low when you think about it. But you can like cycle between them and stuff. But anyway, there's a limited amount of space. So in this diagram, this is your brain. I know it's surprising what it looks like, but this is your brain. And this is specifically your brain when you're making a decision, and in one of these deck builder games. When you're making a decision, oftentimes there's some part of your brain that's doing like busy work, of like usually math, of like what's going to happen if I do this? What's going to happen if I do this? And there's no problem with that, especially if your game is about that. Like if you made some sort of like game to teach people how to multiply numbers together, then you would want that to take up a lot of the cognitive load. But it is my opinion that most of these games are not trying to do that. Hellscaper certainly isn't. And so basically all that space that's taken up in your head is space that is not being taken up by thinking about the decision. And thinking about the decision is like how you learn about it. Because you think about it, you think through the different cases, and then the next time it comes up, you're like, oh, how does that relate to the last time that I did this? And so you really want like the majority of the space to be taken up with the decision. And you also, it's good to increase the clarity of those decisions. So as much as possible, I think it's better to have like, here are all the things you can do, like choose one of them, as opposed to having to figure out what are those things that you can do. And again, like other games might want to do something different, but it's my observation that these games tend to want to be more clear. And as an example of that, this is a screenshot from Monster Train. It's very chaotic. Actually, the whole game is chaotic in the sense that one small change in one place can affect lots of changes other places. Mostly because at the end of your turn, all of your like units attack all the enemy units in this prescribed way. So it's totally deterministic, but it's very chaotic. And so originally they didn't have previews, and Brian Cronin, who's talking to me about this, was saying that originally people basically just weren't willing to do the math. Like, or if they did, they would get really bored. But it's really important to do the math because that informs what your decisions actually are. And it makes it feel fair when you lose, when you knew what the decisions were. So this is what it looks like now. These red circles are highlighting all the previews. So each of these numbers is like how much health these units are gaining and losing. And on the right, you can see that enemy is dying. And then on the far right, that boss is taking 60 damage. And then you're choosing whether or not to play this new card, and you have all the information in front of you to make that decision. And players, like, apparently this is one of the things that get the most feedback on that players love. Because I'm a programmer, I just need to take a second and say that there is like an implementation cost to doing this. One thing, it's like kind of difficult to program for like weird data structure reasons, but also because it means that your game must be deterministic. If there are random things happening in your game, then you can't really have a preview system, which is not totally true, because this is Ring of Pain. It's another roguelike game. It's Deckbuilder adjacent, but an interesting thing that they have is these like percentage chances. So at the bottom left, that red circle is highlighting a percentage chance that it will either take damage or not. And but Ring of Pain gets away with this because it doesn't have a very chaotic system. Basically, like one thing happens at a time. So really, what you want to avoid is the combination of like a chaotic system and having randomness, because then your preview system would look something like a 5-dimensional chess with multiverse time travel, which would be awesome, by the way. I would play the heck out of this roguelike, but it would take up like 10 years of development time. So just be warned. Yeah, okay, so cognitive load, part 2, kind of. It's a case study of when you see a new card. And this is important to think about because seeing a new card in a roguelike, a deck builder roguelike, is like one of the best parts of the game. It's so fun. You think about like, oh, what are all the ways that I can use this card? What are all the implications for it? All that stuff. And when you see a new card, there's like a part of you that's reading the card, and there's a part of you that's thinking about all those exciting possibilities. And you might want the cards to be very complex and have a lot of text on them, but you also want it to be like easy to read them. So that's like a tension. And again, we want to try to reduce busy work and increase clarity. And a really, really great example of that is in Wild Frost. Wild Frost is a deck builder that released recently that has gorgeous art. And not only is the art gorgeous, but it also really helps you to understand what the cards are doing. So on the left, you can see all those cards are heal you in some way, heal your creatures in some way. And they're all pink, and they all have a berry motif, and they all begin with a B. And yeah, when you look at them at a glance, you're like, oh, that heals my guy. And there's even like extra stuff on top of that, like the creature is also a creature, and like the berry blade deals damage. And on the right, you see all those cards related to snow, which is one of the mechanics in the game. And you don't even need to know like what snow does in the game necessarily to know that those cards all kind of go together. And at a glance, you can see that they relate to snow somehow. So contrast that with Hellscaper, right? So on the left is Cerberus, which is like one of my favorite cards in our game. It's obviously playing off of the Greek myth of Cerberus, the three-headed dog, guard dog of hell, which I think is awesome. And it's worth 8 points in a pack of 3, which is super cool. It kind of like evokes the 3 heads and everything. And like players get that pretty easily. On the right is an example of a card that I don't think we did so well with. This is the Ghoul. It's one of the starting cards in the game, so new players have to deal with it. And it's like somewhat understandable, right? You say +1 for each Ghoul in a pack of max 3. Like you can work out what that does, but there's much more of the reading and like comprehension part, and much less of the like, ooh, what are the possibilities for this? Partially because like, why are the Ghouls locked at a pack of 3? Like, what does that mean exactly? Like, what happens if there's just one Ghoul by itself? Those are all questions that players ask, and like we can pop up extra text that explains those things, but it's kind of like a losing battle. And this is like not the fault of our artists at all. We had a lot of constraints on ourselves that we put on ourselves. One of them is just like development time. Part of the reason that we chose this art style, which is pretty minimalist, is to or at least in terms of colors, right? It's pretty monochrome except for the red. Part of the reason we chose that is because we just didn't have that much time to make the game, and so we were trying to work within constraints. But it kind of hampers our ability to do things like Wild Frost, where it has all these like color-coded stuff. And then another thing that hampered us was because it's an 8x8 board, and we wanted the art to read well on both sizes of both the card and on the board. Which again, if we had more development time, like maybe we could have made different portraits for both of those things. But as it was, the art had to read really small, and so there's not as much chance to add those details and make them all look different still. Okay, so this next section is about features that we didn't have time to add to Hellscaper, basically. And I'm going off of Slay the Spire again, because again, like gold standard, great deck builder. And yeah, I'm going to just go through all the features and talk about what it's adding to Slay the Spire and what it might have added to Hellscaper if we had time to add them. So the first is classes. This is like the classic RPG class thing where you have like a warrior, a rogue, a wizard, whatever. And it's actually doing a couple of really specific things. One of them is rule chunking. So in each class, it has a set of mechanics. For instance, this deadly poison is a skill only available to the silent, which is their version of a rogue, and it applies 5 poison. And so you need to know what poison does to understand this card. And the silent is the only class in the game that uses poison. So if you're not playing the silent, you don't need to know what poison does. If you are playing the silent, you definitely need to know what poison does. But what this does for new players is it just lessens the amount of like new stuff that they have to learn, so that they can just focus on the stuff that they the few things that they do have to learn. Another thing is balancing. One of the qualities of these deck builder roguelikes is that all of the pieces really depend on each other a lot, because when you add a new card, you're changing the value of all the other cards, both because you're changing the frequency of how often they show up, and you're also changing the value of them, because whether they synergize together or not will affect how valuable they are. So if you have a class and you only have to worry about all the other cards in that class when you add a card, and then once you're finished with that class and you move on to the next one, that other stuff is like locked. Unless there are things that go across classes, which sometimes happens, but not often in Slay the Spire. Unless there are things like that, you really don't have to worry about the last class that you did when you're implementing the new class. So that lets you add more cards without having to worry about like breaking the balance of your game every time. The other thing that classes do, similar to the rule chunking, is they add multiple skill chains, which I've denoted here by adding a Z and duplicating it multiple times, which is really cool. Yeah, so when we were talking about depth before, we were talking about the length of a skill chain. But really what you care about is like the total length of all the skill chains in the game. So if you can add lots of skill chains and they don't totally map to each other, like progressing along one doesn't mean you're progressing along all of them, then all of that extra length is like extra depth that you get kind of for free. And you still need to worry about like the depth of each one individually, but in general, it's a great way to add lots more depth to the game. And Hellscaper could have used this. It could have used this. The main thing it could have used is the rule chunking part, because again, we kind of introduced a lot of different mechanics, and we could have limited that a lot more. But the balancing and the skill change thing, we didn't really have enough cards for those to be super important. But if we were to add more cards, if we were to expand the game, I think classes is definitely something that we would wanted to look into for those reasons. Another feature that these games have, which like seems kind of obvious, is they have enemies. But Hellscaper doesn't have enemies because Hellscaper, you just have the board and you're building up on the board. And one of the pieces of the design that I was really proud of is how self-sufficient it is in that way, because whenever the nature of these tiling games, because you have multiple tiles on each block that you're placing, whenever you place one, you're kind of constructing your own enemies, because whenever you place one, it has lots of implications for future placements. So I was really proud of that, but it means we don't have enemies, or the equivalent of enemies in Hellscaper would have been to have different starting boards, maybe some tiles that had like downsides and stuff. And so Slay the Spire does have enemies. It's the main thing that you're fighting. And their purpose is essentially to add more factors to both the core loop and to deck building. The way that they add more factors to the core loop is this is the bird here, bird with a Y. You know, it's cool. The bird takes half damage while it's flying, and then once you deal it 3 damage, it gets knocked to the ground and gets stunned. So when you're fighting the bird, there's like a slightly different kind of math that you're doing, like a slightly different kind of decision that you're making because of these properties of the enemy that you're fighting. And all the enemies in Slay the Spire have this, where they're all like slightly different, and they modulate the decisions you're making. The factor to deck building is kind of more subtle and interesting, which is really good players of Slay the Spire like basically know every enemy in the game, and they're not just constructing a deck to be like abstractly good. They're constructing a deck that can win every single fight that they're going to have to fight in. And so there might be a card that isn't as good in your deck, like overall, but you're like, oh, you know what? My deck is really weak to the birds, so I'm going to take this card that's really good against them, just to like hedge against that one fight. So it adds more factors to the deck building and adds more factors to the core loop. Bosses are kind of, I mean, they're a type of enemy, right? They're mostly like enemies, but because they're more powerful, they exert an even stronger effect. So again, they add factors to the core loop, but they actually add so many factors to the deck building that they can invalidate some builds entirely. So this is the Time Eater from Slay the Spire, and it's one of the bosses. It's really hard. I had a super hard time fighting it for a long time. And it has this ability where every 12 cards that you play, you have to just end your turn. And that can be really devastating to some decks that rely on playing lots of cards in the same turn. So when you see a boss coming up, and oftentimes in these games, you have a preview of what boss you're going to be fighting. When you see a boss coming up, it really strongly changes the cards that you want to add to your deck, because it kind of just invalidates some strategies. You're like, okay, I don't want to build this combo deck where I have to play lots of cards because I know I'm fighting the Time Eater and it's going to destroy me. So it adds these interesting like wrinkles where like, okay, in this game I was kind of going for this combo thing, but now I have to pivot and do something else. Right. So yeah, Hellscaper could have used bosses like even more than it could have used enemies. I think a pretty like bang for your buck thing we could have added to really change up the game would be to add bosses that like on the final round of the game or something, the board could just be slightly different and have some sort of tiles that would have like hurt you in some way, or maybe the board being a different size or shape or something like that would have been cool. Okay, yeah. So relics are pretty interesting because they are very similar to cards, except the only difference really is that they don't go into your deck. They just kind of sit there next to the deck. And this is the asterisk that I was talking about for Lucky Landlord. Lucky Landlord has both relics and cards. And relics really they operate very similarly to cards in that they change your deck building decisions. But instead of being part of the core loop decisions, like you're never like choosing to play a relic because they're just again like passive effects, but they modify all of your other decisions. And that's a factor in like right all these things. I'm saying like they modify your decisions, but like that's really what they're doing. Yeah, so relics have this really strong factor in your deck building because they're passive and they're always there. When you add a card to your deck, you're not sure if you're going to draw it, but the relic is just always there. So it can really strongly change the value of some of your cards. And it can also deepen your decisions in the core loop because they can have things like, for instance, the pen nib, which is the image in the top right there. The pen nib, every 10th attack is worth more damage. And so when you're playing with the pen nib, you have to remember, oh, okay, I want to play these cards in a slightly different order because on the 10th one, it's going to be more damage. And relics could have been cool for Hellscaper. I think I don't know exactly what they could have done, but they could have. I think that the deck building factor would have been interesting if we'd balanced the game with relics in mind. Then maybe we could have used that to create more of that complex web I was talking about earlier, where maybe some strategies that aren't viable currently, we can make them more viable and add more paths that you can take through the game. This is the maybe second to last or last slide on features. And health and difficulty, I don't know if they totally sound like they go together, but it's my belief that they do. And they both relate to the idea of the skill chain. So remember when I was talking about the skill chain, each of those nodes is a place where you can be knowledge-wise that basically says you are better than everyone who is on the lower rung of it, like below you. But because it's not a multiplayer game and you don't actually get to test against other players, you are testing against the game. So the difficulty of the game is essentially what node on the skill chain is the game at. And the problem with this is that if you are better than the game, then you are bored because all that space in between feels like, why am I even caring? Like, what was the point of doing that? If you're below the difficulty line, then it's very motivating because you're like, oh, I need to get better. Like, I need to learn something, which is again, okay, fun of learning. But it's also kind of difficult because if you're too far below the line, then you're going to die, and then you have to restart, which people are fine with in roguelikes, but it's nice not to have to die all the time. So health essentially takes the difficulty line and like blurs it out across a bunch of different skill chain like nodes, and it says the farther up you are on this, the better you'll do, but you don't have to be like exactly this good. Like we'll still let you continue even if you don't quite match that. And the health in Slay the Spire is super interesting to me because all the fights are balanced in this very particular way where you're always taking a little bit of chip damage. Like after every fight, mostly, unless you're like really, really good, you're gonna take a little bit of damage. And that means that really good players can show their skill by taking less damage than other players. And that's speaking to that like blurred out line I was talking about. And ultimately it comes down to feeling listened to by the game, I think. It's like the game is hearing that you're good at the game and is rewarding you. And it feels bad if it doesn't do that. So an example from Hellscaper. So we have basically the only progression in the game is the number of points you have to make for each board, and that obviously increases for each board, for each city that you're constructing. But what that means is that for players who played a lot, the early boards become very easy, and so players were getting bored. I was talking to one person who said that they just placed things randomly on the board, and that's obviously a big problem because it means that the game like isn't listening to you for the whole first round if you're a really good player. So the way that we combated this was we took, you see the turns remaining thing on the top left. Basically, for every 3 turns that you have remaining at the end of a round, you get 1 turn extra on the next round, and that essentially like tightens up this whole system where now no matter how well or poorly you're doing, for every 3 turns that you didn't spend, or for every 3 turns that you've accomplished it in, you get a little bonus. And so that means that the game is always listening to you. And the only problem with this is that we did a terrible job explaining this to players. The same person who said he places cards randomly down on the board Also, did not know that this mechanic existed because we just did not communicate it to the player. So that was on us. But at least when I was playing the game, I felt listened to because I would always try to go for 9 turns remaining, which is hard but doable. Okay, so a little bit more on difficulty. This is kind of a reiteration of the previous thing, but there's this difficulty line where it's easy at the beginning and hard towards the end, classic video game stuff. But because players can be so good that they are at like the higher level, it means that the whole getting up to that point is boring. And so one way that people solve this is through optional risks that you can take on that have a reward. So in that case, players balance the game for themselves because they have the option of taking on extra risks to get a reward. So if they're feeling like the game is easy, they'll do that. And if they're at a hard section, then they won't do that. Or they will, and then they'll realize they were greedy and lose, which is also really fun in roguelikes. The other point is points, which, like I was saying, kind of like blur out this line and make it so that there's a little bit more wiggle room. And points just mean like any variable number that can change depending on how well you did at the game in one of these fights or one of the levels. So health is an example of points. In Wild Frost doesn't really have health, but what it does have is gold, which you can use on lots of things. And for each fight, if you get a combo, so like killing multiple enemies in the same round, which is kind of hard to do, you get extra gold. So really good players of Wild Frost will try to get as many combos as they can, which essentially increases the difficulty for themselves, but like arbitrarily, right? So if they're at a hard fight, they'll just choose not to do the combos. But if they're in an easy fight, it's something extra that they can do. Yeah. So we're getting towards the end here. Before I leave, I just wanted to say that I chose to do this talk from the perspective of K-Fun and from the perspective of depth, because I thought that is like the most bang for your buck way of thinking about this. Again, I think K-Fun is like the main flavor that people enjoy in deck builder roguelikes and to some extent in strategy games in general. So it's frequently a problem that you don't have enough of it in your game. So everything in this talk was just like how to maximize K-Fun. But that is like absolutely not required. I wouldn't want all games to just maximize K-Fun all the time. I was talking with someone the other day who was saying that if you're just trying to maximize K-Fun, then you would want the player to like learn everything in like a single second and have some like brilliant revelation, which would be like a really cool game, but like not all games would be like that, right? So this is the diagram that's saying that I think games can elicit all sorts of kinds of emotions. I love games that do all sorts of things. We were talking earlier about horror games. Like I'm a huge fan of horror games. I think they're really cool. And they explore all these other emotions that are not fun. And then within emotions, there's all the things that we call fun. And then within that is K-Fun, which is just a small portion of that. So I really don't want anyone to take this away thinking like, oh, I got to maximize K-Fun in my game. This talk is just if you want to maximize K-Fun, this is how I've observed people do it, at least in Deckbuilder. And that was my talk. Thank you. And now it's time for questions.
That was awesome, Ezra. Good
Thanks.
job. Hey, I was in my car at the beginning, but when you mentioned the K-Fun, what's the background there? Where should I find more information on what that is? I missed it.
Yeah. So this is a term introduced by Ralph Koster in his book, A Theory of Fun. So yeah, just read that book, I guess.
Theory of Fun. All right, checking it out.
Yeah, recommend.
Awesome. So, do we have questions? Are people putting questions?
I'll ask a question.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Hi, Ezra. Eitan
Hi.
from Firehose. Can you talk about like promoting and releasing your game at all, and what your experience was with that?
Sure. So I'm not as experienced that part. That's part of why I wanted to focus on this like K-Fun stuff because it's more towards the game design and less towards the marketing. But I definitely have some thoughts about marketing. I well, yeah, just another caveat before I start talking about it is that we only released on itch. So we haven't released on Steam. This is kind of it was our senior capstone project, so we wanted to get the experience of making it, but not necessarily go through the whole release thing. One of the things that I think is interesting about okay, well, let me back up for a second. The way that I like to think about making games these days, or one of the ways, is in terms of having like a like designing the machine that exists that includes both your game and also all the ways that people are going to talk about and experience your game. And so an example of a game I think does that super well is Your Only Move is Hustle, or Yomi Hustle. It is this really interesting turn-based fighting game, but it does this trick where at the end of your game, you get a replay of your game that's a video, and in the video, it's not turn-based. So it just looks like you're having the coolest anime fight ever. And the reason that I played Yomi Hustle is because I saw those videos online. I was like, I want to do that. So I think that's a game that has this really great machine that includes both the game and how people talk about it. So my observation about Deckbuilder roguelikes is that the main sort of extra component of the machine that's outside of the game is YouTube currently. And so one of the things I was trying to think about that I don't think we did super well for Hellscaper, but I would think about more if I was trying to make a more commercial game, would be like just what are all the thumbnails that someone could make for this game? Like, yo, this deck is sick, or like having a screenshot of like a certain boss that's doing something crazy, or like I think for every like YouTube thumbnail for your game, it's like an extra, however many people are going to play it, or like more potential for people to cover it. And again, I didn't do this so much for Hellscaper, but I think I did a pretty good job of that in Be Honest, which is a horror game that I made that did pretty well. And yeah, when I was making that, I was thinking, what are all the moments in this game that people are gonna like go crazy about? And so in that game, for instance, like there's a part where the game takes control of your mouse, and I was like, when I was putting that in, I was like, oh yeah, people are gonna go crazy about this. And then I was, justified when I saw like a TikTok that got like a huge amount of views or something, where someone was like, yo, what's controlling my mouse? So yeah, I guess I would kind of a vague answer, but I'd think about the machine that exists between your game and the people talking about your game.
Awesome. Thank you for the answer.
We also have a speaker questions channel that's it's in voice channels. If anyone wants to drop a question in text form. Yeah, right in there. Ezra just said hi in it.
I have a question. There's no like
Yeah.
raising in Discord, so I guess I just have to yell. Also, hey, Ezra, thank you for the talk. It was great. At some point during your talk, you had a diagram of kind of like the wells. I'm like, how did you know? How did you know this was? I didn't even describe it.
Oh, I made this slide thinking about the conversation we've been having, so it makes sense to me.
Great. So some of the pieces or cards or tiles in House of Tiles, that's what they're called. Tiles, they're also cards.
It's confusing.
They feel like
Yeah.
they feel like they don't fall into these wells. Like one of the cards is the Collector, which just like eats everything on the board.
Yeah.
Did these wells, I guess like did these wells form kind of organically? Like did you end up like making them unintentionally and then just leaning into them? And like with cards like the Collector, just cards that do kind of like a big splashy thing that don't fall into one of these kind of synergy buckets. Did you feel like you were doing those intentionally to try and make your game more towards the right? Do you feel like they worked or didn't work for some particular reason?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'm so happy you asked the question about this slide. The Collector is super interesting. I'd forgotten about that card. For everyone who hasn't played the game before, the Collector basically, when you place it, it absorbs the points of all the other tiles on your board, which seems very good. But then once you play it, you realize that it's actually very bad because there's a part of the game that relies on these rivers of blood, and it absorbs those, and then you're kind of screwed. So yeah, a couple things about the Collector and about these. I wish that I had thought about this more before I designed the game, because I think it's way too much on the left and not as much on the right. The collector is interesting because it's kind of like it almost falls more into like the relic category that I was talking about. Because legendary doesn't show up very often, it kind of functions more as like you see it and then there's a possibility that you can do this one really crazy thing. And I don't think it contributes very much to the K fun, and I don't think it contributes very much to this web of synergies. Like you're not really making decisions considering like, ooh, what if I get the collector? But I think what it does add is one of those like memorable moments, which is another thing that I liked about, or I like to think about when making games is like how many memorable moments are there going to be, and the moment that you take the collector and then you play it and you realize that it's actually really bad unless you have something really specific going on, is an awesome memorable moment. But and you know what? Now I'm saying that, I think it does relate a little bit to K-Fun because it's like a very powerful moment of learning. You're like, oh, this is bad for this reason. But yeah, I don't think it really contributes very much to this. But I would agree that the collector is more of the thing on the right than the thing on the left, because it's kind of one of these tiny little nodes where it's like it's really good with the vampire and like not anything else.
That's a cool. That's a good strategy tip too. I didn't. Let's see what the vampire does.
Oh yeah, oops. Well, you got some cape on there for free.
It sounds like the kind of thing that's like good to layer on later
Mm.
to increase those like luck, the fun of luck. You know, like if you've any roguelike or if you've played like NetHack or Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup roguelikes, you know, there's times where you get a relic dropped at the beginning of the game and suddenly you can build your entire character around it. And that's not a strategy that you shoot for, but when it happens, you get to send screenshots to your friends of like, oh my God, look at this incredible thing that just happened. I got a collector and then I built around it for the entire rest of the game.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's part of the reason I was hammering so much on the like, this is just talking about K-Fun thing, because yeah, there's all sorts of other pleasures of these games, like the fun, the randomness thing you mentioned. I think the way I would maybe tie it back is like, if those runs happen pretty infrequently, even if they're not super deep in and of themselves, it's kind of like the class thing where it's a separate little tiny skill chain where you can be like, oh, I just got this thing, I'm gonna try building around it, and then you learn something about it. And that can be fun in a K-Fun kind of way.
Cool. Thanks.
Ezra, I've got a question. First off, thanks for an awesome talk.
Thanks.
You know, you had that slide with the Reddit post of just like talking about theories for, you know, how to strategize on these kinds of games. Did you find yourself like designing around that? Like seeing what kind of strategies people wrote down and thinking, oh, well, I want to like prepare for this somehow or like make this possible or not possible?
Interesting. Not that much. I mean, so partially it's because like we don't have a subreddit. Right? This is from Slay the Spire, so no one is talking about Hellscaper like this. The most there was a couple of people who I'm friends with who like the game, who I talk with about it. That's obviously really really fun, and there are things that you like take from that. You're like, oh, maybe I should enhance this thing, or this thing isn't quite working out, so I need to like change it. But for the most part, yeah, I wasn't really like evaluating how long it takes people to explain things and then like trying to expand that, if that's what you're asking.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah. But that could be interesting. I don't know, maybe you should.
Did you run into or think about the balance between like K-Fun and depth and clarity of decision making, where if you provide too much information, you take away some of the K-Fun, but without enough information, it's hard to grok the depth, and you like that thing you talked about where it's like it's hard to understand what your decision should be.
Yes, I've definitely thought about that. Honestly, that's something that I don't feel like I totally understand yet. Maybe after I make a couple more of these games, I will. But there is something there. I think in general, if you're making a really deep one of these games, like there's not that much of a worry that you're going to explain too much because they just end up being so deep. Like players will just find more stuff to learn about. So I think one of the things I was thinking about talking about the slide too is like, I had the sense as a designer that I was like a little bit worried about reducing this sort of like busy work stuff because it's like, people are gonna like figure out my game too quickly. But I think that's kind of wrong-headed, partially because like you can always just add more like cards and stuff like just add more stuff for people to learn and then have them learn it, as opposed to like trying to obscure the things that already are there. But that's another one of those things where it's like that's a tip to maximize K-Fun, but not all games want to do that. Like I've been super interested recently in like the kind of like cryptic games that don't explain themselves at all, and that's kind of like on the way other side of things. And it's also related to K-Fun because you're like learning what the consequences of the space are. So I guess it's more of an aesthetic choice, like which one you want to go for. I think the math part is, I think, really egregious, where it's like if it's just multiplying two numbers together, like computers can do that. Like just let give them the number, like instead of making them do it themselves.
Cool. Hey, I have a question.
Yeah.
So now that you're a deck building master, uh, what, so like if you like, so all the stuff that you've learned, like like if you went back in time, like what would you do differently on Hellscaper? Like that,
Yeah.
like now that you know better, like what would you do?
Such a great question. Yeah, I think as I've been making this talk, the thing I was most thinking about was like, what kind of deck builder would I make knowing all this stuff? And I think maybe for ego reasons, I was like not thinking as much about like specifically how would I have given myself advice for Hellscaper. I think that the main thing is like in terms of like bang for your buck, right? Like Luck Be a Landlord exists and works, and it has very few of those features that I talked about in Slay the Spire. So just in terms of development time, I think the place we could have added the most K-Fun for the least amount of like extra programming work would have been on this synergy portion where we like I really explicitly designed the game in a way that gave me this by starting with the end decks and working backwards, which in retrospect is just a terrible idea because it like guarantees that there's not going to be this. Maybe there's some sort of process where you start with this and then you like unknit it and like try to connect everything together. That could be interesting. There definitely were upsides to doing it this way because I think it made the core loop very deep and fun because we were able to make sure that every resulting deck had this like deep feel. Yeah, one of the other things we learned was that like we originally had this idea that we are going to add like god tiles that were going to be super super powerful, and you would get like kind of later on in the game, and they would just like give a benefit to like every card of a certain type on the board. And we realized that that would be really not fun in the tile placing part because if something affects everything on the board, then it doesn't matter where it goes. And so if you end up with a deck of a bunch of them, then you're not really playing a game anymore for that part. So there were definitely upsides to thinking about how the cards were going to work together, but I think we should have embraced a little bit more of the like organic chaos of like having this complex web of stuff, as opposed to doing this like buckets approach.
Did you talk about doing god tiles like outside of tiles, like a totem?
Right,
or
as
something?
relics.
Yeah, like relics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We didn't so much, partially because we were just like we're not doing relics for time reasons.
Right.
But yeah, that could be interesting in terms of like yeah, it's tricky for Hellscaper specifically because the numbers are so chunky that the +1 to everything is like it'd probably be too strong. Like you wouldn't really be able to win a game unless you had that, if it was balanced for that. But yeah, it would definitely be interesting. Or maybe like for every 5 tiles you get an extra point or something. But another design rule that we had for ourselves was all of the points that you get are going to be represented as cards on the board. So you can always calculate it by just adding all the cards together, which we did for clarity reasons. And I'm pretty happy with that. But we would have had to reconsider that if we had relics, I think.
Cool.
Can I ask a question about your answer?
Yeah,
Um,
recursive.
you described the process was you started from finished decks and worked backwards. How did you come up with the finished decks in the first place? Like, was that an organic process?
Um, It was a chaotic process. We like basically were just like, oh, it'd be cool, and then we made a big spreadsheet of cards, and then we tried to sort them into like things that would work together. Partially because we were like kind of adding them to the game in chunks. So it was like, here's a chunk of cards that'll work together, like to make sure that they would all like function as cards in the game, because at least they'll work together. But we should have done more work to say like, how does this card relate to all the cards that have come before it, instead of like just how do these relate as a unit. I think.
Cool.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great.
Cool.
I'm kind of imagining this idea of like kind of having like a multi-level map of this synergy thing where there's like mechanics and buckets and figuring out how those work together and then diversifying within them. And connecting those, like instead of only fire works with fire, like well, fire augments these other things over here, and then you can create fire decks, but then you also know that fire can work well with everything else and what the impact of adding fire is. I don't know. Does that seem reasonable? Because it seems like the reason I started thinking about this is because the two drawings creates a dichotomy that I don't think you're actually suggesting. Like there's got to be like a continuum between those two things, right?
Yeah, definitely. I should have drawn a line between them to represent that. But yeah, these are slides that I cut because I didn't think that they went into like the flow of the talk very much. But one of the things I was talking about with Axolotl Star, who is the designer for Star Vaders, is this idea of anti-synergy in games as being this really important way of distinguishing between different runs of the same archetype. And that in that example, it's kind of like you take one of those buckets and then you like split it in half or something. But the problem with anti-synergy is that it can feel bad if it's like explicitly called out, like this is destroyed if it's next to this, and you're like, why are you doing this thing to me? So I was thinking about like ways that games have this, and I put it into these three chunks of if they use up the same resource, then they're inherently bad together because you only have so much of that resource. That's what Slay the Spire does with like mana or like whatever the energy is for the game. Because like if you take too many cards that are worth a lot of mana or cost a lot of mana, they're going to be worse together. But it's like this subtle synergy thing or anti-synergy. Another way is if they serve the same purpose, but that purpose is only something that you need like a couple times. Because then if you have too many of them, it's like too much of a good thing, and like you're not getting the benefit anymore. And then same downside, like if a bunch of cards have the same downside, like for instance, like costing health, then if you take too many of them, you end up like killing yourself by playing these cards. So these are a bunch of ways of kind of introducing some wrinkles into that space, besides just synergy or like buffing everything up.
Any other questions? Just shout it out.
Hi, Ezra. I have a question.
Hi.
So you have a really good understanding of deck building games. I really enjoyed your talk. You definitely have a really good grasp. And so I was wondering, are you thinking about making another deck building game? Are you thinking of expanding on the current game?
I am thinking about those things. I would really like to do that, especially after giving this talk. Like part of me doing this was like an excuse to interview a bunch of people who've thought deeply about it. Like a lot of these ideas are not mine, I'm just synthesizing them. But yeah, like one of the things I've been doing while I was making this talk is like, man, I have this idea for like a deck builder where you fight the internet, and so all the enemies are like different like factions of the internet, and then there's like a bunch of different classes that are all these crazy things. But that goes to like the streamer thing, right? It's streamer bait. But anyway, yeah,
Right.
I mean, I have tons of ideas. The thing is, they're like really hard to make. Another idea I have actually is I want to make a game engine for making deck builders, which I would love to do, but again, would be really hard like programming wise. But the answer is yes, I have a lot of ideas, but I'm not sure if I'll do them in the classic game dev way.
Cool. Is this your first attempt at a deck builder?
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Actually, it didn't even start out as a deck builder. We were starting with the idea of doing a minimalist city builder, and then we kind of did that, and we were like, okay, we're like halfway through the year. We could expand it somehow, or we could just polish this. And we all decided like we kind of want to learn about this deck builder thing, and so even if it like doesn't turn out like as good necessarily like polish wise, we want to learn about it and try it. Plus, like we're all fans of them, so yeah, we decided to go for it.
Awesome. How long has the game been out?
It has been out. Well, that's a tricky question because we started putting up builds like really early, and technically we still have kind of some plans of like polishing up some more. But it's like it's out now, and like question mark about like if it's even done yet. But yeah, I dropped a link in the in somewhere in presenter info. Yeah, I dropped a
Perfect.
link in presenter info.
Do you have any plans or reasons you didn't put it on Steam?
Kind of like time reasons, I guess, and like somewhat of feeling like it wasn't like done enough for Steam or something. But I have some regret about that. Yeah, not a great reason.
Got it. Oh, and I was wondering, do you know what the K in K-Fun stands for?
I don't know. I should have looked more into that. I think you could assume that it stands for Coster.
Okay.
But I don't know. I think it's just like
Just
fun
mean
prime,
nothing.
like yeah, just made up for the sake of distinguishing it from fun.
Awesome. How big was your team size for this game?
Just 4 people plus. Oh, I don't think I mentioned that. Achiro was our mentor for the game, who's like super helpful and great. Yeah. So the 4 of us plus Achiro mentoring us.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the talk.
Thanks.
I have a question, another one,
Yeah.
unrelated to Hellscaper.
Yeah.
So what is a game design that is not a deck builder that you definitely want to try to make someday, besides Be Honest? The game, Be Honest.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, a bajillion of games. I'm trying to be more discerning with the games that I make in terms of like, if I think that they'll be able to like do well in some way, or if I'll like learn something making them. I just made a game jam game with Tom that was really fun. We made like a sort of journaling game. So I'm interested in that thread of like games that ask you questions that you then respond to. I think that's super interesting. A lot of my games are kind of in that vein. I would love to make a heist game at some point. I love like the idea of a heist. I think it's super fun and not enough heist games. I love the ones that already exist, but I want more of them. Yeah, I'd love to make more deck builder games. I'm kind of in this like horror kick also of like, yeah, really enjoy like evoking creepy feelings and stuff. So yeah, all those threads, not anything super specific, but yeah.
How actually was it working on, because you worked on the Tiny Mask game, Be Honest, and Hellscape at the same time? Like, how did you manage that? How was that?
I guess there's like not working on either one in like too many hours in the same week. But also I was a student at the time, so there's like some affordances there. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of nice to be working on something that takes up different parts of your brain. Like be honest, with a lot of writing and not as much programming, and this is more programming and design and not as much writing. There's like not any text in the game that doesn't exist on the cards besides like some instructions, basically.
Right. Smart. Yeah.
Yeah.